Welcome to another edition of the Giants Huddle podcast, brought to you by PSEG, energy efficiency for game time and anytime. Visit pseg.com/Giants for discounts, rebates, and home energy assessments. I'm John Schmeelk, and this week's Giants Huddle is longtime NFL scout, former Patriots executive, and 13-year general manager of the Atlanta Falcons. Now he's the CEO of SumerSports, an analytics company. He is Thomas Dimitroff. Thomas, how are you, man? Welcome to the Giants Huddle.
You make me sound really old, man. I'm like
not old, just important. Just important, not old.
I got it. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
No problem. So I guess before we kind of dig into some of the details here, Thomas, why don't we just have you take your 20,000-foot view of where the Giants are in their second year of the Schoen Daboll regime?
Let me start by saying this, because this is 100% the truth, and I'm happy to laud both your general manager and your head coach, Joe Schoen, Brian Daboll. They come in with really good reputations as being football men, tough guys, straightforward, take care of business. And a year in, all of our contemporaries in the National Football League think very highly of them. They're kicking off their, now into their second year with a lot of really strong respect. That's not always easy, John, in that first year. A lot of people are still guessing and questioning. Of course, Brian wins the coach of the year. Did Joe Schoen win executive of the year?
He did not, no.
Well, he should have. I'm a big believer in that they need to go hand in hand. I had some opportunities with Mike Smith, and it's a big thing, right? But I like where the organization is. Of course, great people at the lead. Of course, at the very top with John Mara. I mean, look, you guys have such a sound organization that a lot of teams look at, and a lot of teams are jealous of. As it pertains to the big picture and the moves that they're making, I know we're going to go into those details. I step back and I look at all the teams that I'm looking at, throughout the NFL, and I really want to say, two very smart men with very thoughtful approaches, not haphazard. Everything seems to have a really thought out approach to it, which we'll get into when we're talking about some of the position moves. Look, that's a thing that Brian Daboll, of course, brings from the Patriots, right? They are always thought out. I know he's not directly from the Patriots, but all of us who have spent time with the Patriots, man, you wouldn't have gotten out of that organization without having that drilled into you, right? Bill Belichick used to teach all of us and drill it into our heads, along with Scott Pioli. It was about, your organization better than anyone in this country. Of course, media, anyone else. As a head coach and a GM, you make your plans, you make your direction and your journey along with your head coach, and don't look back. And it just feels like they're doing that, right? It feels like they have a really strong opinion about how they want to approach in free agency. And then you have the draft here, of course, which is another thing I'll talk about. But I feel like they're looking in free agency, hitting on some of the areas they need to hit on, re-signing where they need to re-sign. And then all of a sudden, oh, by the way, what do we have? 10 or 11 draft picks?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a great feeling, John, going in, knowing that the uncertainty of the draft has been taken care of a little bit by making sure that you've signed the guys you've signed in free agency.
Yeah, they had 11-10 after the Darren Waller trade, which we'll talk about a little bit more. And it's funny, you talk about planning, right, and having a vision. I imagine, though, that Joe Schoen's vision probably had to change a little bit. When he got hired last year, I'm sure he thought this was probably more of a tear-down, rebuild situation. Then in the first year, 9-7-1, you make the playoffs, you win a playoff game. How much do you think he's had to alter, and how, for someone that's been in that chair, do you have to keep an open mind and be willing to alter what your plan is based on what you see happen on the field, which might be sometimes unexpected in a good way?
Yeah, I think oftentimes when you're on the outside looking in as a general manager, as a personnel director, and as an assistant GM, you're hoping everything goes nice and clean and you have this compartmentalized approach. The reality is, man, once you cross that proverbial line, it's go, and you have to be agile. I mean, I continue to talk to any of my contemporaries around the league now that are in those spots, and any of the people that are rising to be in that spot. Agility, versatility. We say the same thing, John, about players, right? We expect that out of players. Believe me, in today's world, you expect it out of general managers. And this, I mean, it's an overused phrase, and not for long, but it's more not for long than ever in this league, right? Sure. These guys coming out of it. I mean, back in the day, general managers were making a few $100,000. These guys are making a lot of money. A lot is riding on them, a lot of pressure, John. And I'd also say A guy like Joe, really together guy, again, really nice background in football. So to your point, he's going to have to be able to move. He's going to have vision looking ahead. And I feel like he's done that. He realizes now he wasn't sure, I'm sure, as well as Brian coming in to say, what are we going to do with our quarterback and what are we going to do with the running back? To me, those questions were answered. And what a great feeling that was to say, wow, we worked with these guys. Our system worked with these guys. We're in the best place that we can be in, given the situation. Look, there are a lot of other guys that get in that role as a first-time GM, and they're pulling their hair out as they're going through that first season with their so-called pillar players, and they're thinking, what are we going to do here? That was already, I'm sure, I mean, you think about it, that was taken care of. And in the back of their mind, like, okay, that's a good, solid feeling. Now let's get creative with how we're going to put together this team.
Yeah, and now let's talk about how you put the team together around those guys, right? Because, like I mentioned, 9-7-1, won a lot of close games, probably in a lot of people's mind overachieved a little bit. So now how do you continue forward here and build around that? Because, ownership, I'm sure, and the fans, you want to keep improving, you want to do more. But if you try to do too much too fast, you can sometimes jeopardize your long-term goal, right, of being a Super Bowl contender. So how do you now build from this spot where you're above 500 team, won a playoff game, but you still a younger team, and build the right way to get where you want to go?
I think it all starts with building around Daniel Jones, right? Let's call it the way it is. I had an opportunity to do that with Matt Ryan, and we built over the years. And Matt was a very, very sound top tier quarterback. I did steal a page from the Bill Polian book, although heresy in New England, right? We never wanted to say that we were pulling anything from Bill. And I like Bill a lot, have a great deal of respect for him, of course, as well as Coach Belichick. But the idea of surrounding your quarterback and an up-and-coming quarterback with the right players, of course, that's not rocket science, right? Let's see how we do that. Let's get, again, creative with how we do that. The interesting parallel that I have here, and this sort of interesting bond that I have with Joe Schoen was, in our second year in Atlanta, not to talk about Atlanta too much, with Matt Ryan, evolving every game, every session, every year. In 2009, if you remember, we traded for Tony Gonzalez. So there's an interesting parallel. I'm not saying Darren Waller is Tony Gonzalez. I am saying he's a damn good tight end, very athletic. You put that athletic guy around a quarterback who's still growing and evolving all the time. Matt and Daniel Jones have certain similarities. Daniel, believe me, is a much better runner and a much better sort of athlete that way. But they both were guys. They're just both such sound guys, and you want to grow and get them better. Putting a tight end around them, I can't tell you how important that is. Now, there could be some people out there that are saying, well, it's such a strong draft class with tight ends. Why wouldn't you wait? Well, simply stated, I know how this is. You see 2 third-rounders there, right? That's what they doled out. That 100, was it a 101 or 10, whatever?
Yeah. It was the compensatory pick that the Chiefs had given him in the Tony trade.
Right. So you look as both Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll are saying, okay, we have an opportunity to get a proven factor as a tight end, and not projecting from a pick in the third round or whatever it may be. That's a settling feeling. Remember, this is something, again, that connection with Josh McDaniel and their general manager, of course, Ziggs, who, we're in New England. The connection there is a really important thing. So you can get some really good background information on a player that's coming, from the Raiders. I think that's an important thing for them. They realize they have an experienced guy. Yes, D. Waller has had some injuries, but if you guys believe that you have, if the Giants believe that they have a really sound performance group, keep the guys healthy. I would say that about any of the guys that you've brought in, a little aside, whether it's Paris Campbell or whoever else has been nicked a little bit, get them in the right situation where they're training properly. And you guys have a really good understanding of that. Then you believe that you can keep them healthy, and then they can grow around Daniel Jones, starting with a tight end, starting with, you all know that you need to continue to build that receiver group. Everyone knows that, right? Who's going to be the stud? Well, it's good to know while you're looking for that stud receiver that you have a tight end like this who is as athletic as he is. And I think that's a really important point.
All right, well, so I guess I'll keep following along this line of thought then. How do you acquire a stud receiver now? Do you have to draft them or do you have to trade for one? Because it seems like the top true number ones don't even really reach free agency anymore, right?
Yeah, I'm not going in free agency. If humbly, if I were to be Joe and Brian, I'm done in free agency right now. That first wave, you might find someone down the line, and that, those next 2-3 weeks of wave. It wasn't like it was the strongest group out there. I don't see you guys going after Odell Beckham. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. You could answer that question, or whoever it may be out there. I would really focus in on that draft group. The same thing. The draft group's not being discussed as one of these like top-notch draft groups, but you can find some good football players in there that you can develop. You always have to keep your eye on finding, in my mind. I mean, we had Julio Jones, of course, along with Tony Gonzalez, and then we just kept building. We always had those receivers around, Matt. We had
Roddy White too, right?
We had Roddy White, exactly. And then when it was time and Roddy was moving on, Julio became the guy, of course, we go after Calvin Ridley. That was unfortunate because he was a really good football player. Of course, he had his gambling issue, but really important for us to have that group always growing and evolving. And I would suggest that's one of the things that your group is going to say there, like, got to always keep a revolving group of receivers there, fresh, fast, and ready to go. I think you guys have some speed on that in that group.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask, how do you think about the way they're trying to build that out a little bit? Because it seemed like this offseason, they've really prioritized speed, right? Slayton, 4.3 guy, Paris Campbell, 4.3 guy, even Jeff Smith, who hasn't done a lot in the league. He's a really fast player too, that, maybe they're going away from those kind of bigger contested catch guys and focusing on separators and speed.
Right, man. I look at that and I'm thinking, hands down, categorically, you need speed. This is a matchup league. Again, we sit there and we think about making sure that someone can rip the top off to open it up underneath for Darren Waller as well as whoever else, Paris Campbell. That's a big thing in my mind, right? When, again, back to Julio quickly, this sounds crazy and you'll hate to hear this, and your Giants fans will hate to hear this. But when we were trying to figure out what we were going to do back in 2011, we were looking at other teams. We were obviously looking at your nemesis. We were looking at the Eagles, and we were looking at receivers there that always kept us on our heels on defense. Whether you threw the ball to Julio Jones 14 times or whether it was only 3 times, any route you ever ran with those guys that can rip it off the top, it opens and creates elements underneath that I think are really high percentage shots for a guy like Daniel Jones as he continues to develop.
Now, you mentioned this earlier. You built around Matt Ryan in Atlanta after you paid him, right? Now the Giants have paid Daniel Jones. So you had to be a little bit more creative. It's not as easy as building around a quarterback on a rookie contract. So how do you manage the cap now moving forward, knowing what you have your quarterback on and trying to build around him? Where can you save? Where do you think you have to spend? How do you just holistically manage that cap to maximize your window once you have paid your franchise quarterback?
It's a great question. It is, of course, all about cap management, right? I mean, if you get a chance and you get a chance to go to the business of sport, they do a great job there just explaining that when there's this discussion, like, you can't win and you can't build when you start paying your quarterback. There's no question you can. I think if you do the calculations, I think it's between 25 and 30 of your players are under rookie contracts. The cap, just to put everyone's mind at ease, is set up to build in this way, right? It's not just, oh my God, we've signed Daniel Jones and life is over as we know it. It's creativity. It's thinking, look, there's a lot of players, back to versatility. There's the number 3 corners, the number 3 receivers. I mean, what they're doing with the receivers right now, making sure that you're smart in how you're putting together your offensive line. Again, John, I don't want to go and talk about their philosophy, but big picture philosophy. Every team has a different opinion about where they want to save their money and what position groupings they do. I'm a big believer in having pillar positions taken care of almost at each position. And then around those main studs, you're building around them, and some you're building down the liners, right? You can get some good football players out there that are the back end of the roster that you're saving. I'm not a big believer in spending a ton of money on those midline, middle-class veterans. There's a place for them. Don't believe me. I sit there and I think about Wink Martindale's comments about Jihad, right? Wasn't he talking to the re-signing there and how he wants them around there? Yes, you pay some of those guys a little bit more money if they're the leadership guys you're looking for. but you don't do that too often along your roster. You have to be smart with how you're differentiating between a guy that is truly a leader, veteran, that you're going to pay a little bit more for, and the young guy that you want to develop. Look, one of the things I think is vital, and Brian Daboll has a really good understanding of this, you have to develop the players. He's working hand in hand with a very good general manager and team builder. You have to develop. The teams out there that don't develop, won't go into naming some of the head coaches over the years, they've failed ultimately because they're just not willing as a staff to put the time in to develop. And that's a big part of it.
Yeah, and we'll get to this year's draft in a little bit where you have to get those players to develop, get them on those rookie deals. Final team building question, Tom's, before we move on. The Giants have a lot of, and fortunately, I think pillar players on rookie contracts they haven't paid yet. Dexter Lawrence, who maybe was the best defensive tackle in football last year. Andrew Thomas, one of the better offensive tackles in football. You hope Evan Neal at some point develops into that as well. You have Xavier McKinney at safety. How much planning and how do you plan ahead, knowing maybe you have these big contracts for very important players coming down the road when you're trying to manage your cap? Take me through that as a former GM, how you work that process.
Yeah, I mean, we're always looking 2 years, 3 years in advance. Of course, that's really, really important. And I will get an opportunity to laud another person in your building. I mean, Kevin Abram is one of the very best out there, right? His knowledge of cap, his vision of cap is a really big thing. So once again, to your listeners, I mean, a bang up crew of football people that are going to help in that way. So as far as Joe Schoen sitting down with Kevin and co and trying to figure out, what's next, that's a process. It's not always easy, right? Because, you can only project so far, right, John? I mean, you never know with injuries. I mean, injuries in the end are the things that we all pull our hair out over, right? It's so tough to project those. But maybe if I'm answering your question correctly, I think we always tended to look, in those 2 years ahead, especially. And, it's interesting because I would sit down with Dan Quinn on my final time there, and we would always go over our roster. I mean, literally every week we'd be talking about the next wave and who truly is rising, who truly is falling. And we would monitor that on our rosters, right? With basically proverbial arrows up and proverbial arrows down. And if the players that we were looking at continued to have the arrows down, then of course we were saying, look, coming up in the next year, we know that this is not potentially a guy that we will not be looking to, secure on future deals. It's ever evolving and changing. And you can have a head coach and a general manager who have a really strong opinion about it. And ultimately, they are the ones that make the decision. Remember, however, there's the coordinators on both sides and the position coaches who have their opinions, which becomes a very complicated thing for a general manager when you're team building, right? Because the days of George Young, where I would assume, where there was a lot of heavy pounding of a fist on the table, no, this is what we're doing. I have to suggest to most people, that's not how it works in the NFL in today's world. It's a definite partnership between both of the coach and the GM. You're factoring in some of the coaches that you trust, as well as ownership. And you just have to monitor along the way. And that's a long-winded way of saying you have to be flexible, of course, and you have to project. If it works out, great. If not, then it's obviously it can be a black mark.
Yeah, I got to imagine George Young did a lot of desk pounding, and then Parcells did a lot of yelling and cursing, and they went back and forth, and they had fun. And that's kind of probably how that relationship went. All right, I already touched on some of these moves real quick. You kind of talked about Daniel already, but your thoughts on how they worked that contract, getting him off that tag, and getting him on that long-term deal.
Look, I was really happy to see that. I mean, point blank, going in, knowing that you have a quarterback that you can grow with as a second-year GM and head coach. Man, it's a relief. I can't stress that enough. Knowing that he can run, knowing that he didn't have to deal with some of the injuries that he had dealt with, right? That's a big and important thing. Seeing the evolution of it all. So doing the contract the way they did, I was all for that. I was really happy because segues into your next point, right? You have a guy you're going to grow with, you believe in, and you trust, and it gives you an opportunity to keep a running back. So you truly are walking away, as everyone knows, with your two pillar players going into your second year. That is a very reassuring feeling. And if you want to talk about Saquon, yeah. I mean, to me, I thought that was well thought out once again, and it would be exactly what I would have done. I had some discussions with some of our quant employees within SumerSports, because of course everyone thinks they have strong opinions, right? And I said, put yourself in that seat. You can have all these ideas about moving Saquon or not, or tagging, Daniel on something like this and not getting a deal done. The reality is you need to go into your second year in this regime with solid and sound. And that's what I think they've done.
Do you think there's a chance to get Barkley off that franchise tag? Or if you're running the show, would you rather have him on that tag and go year to year with the running back?
I would like to work on it. I think it's important. He is, obviously is such a good player and he's such an important part of that organization. If you can't, I wouldn't be losing too much sleep on it, to be honest with you. I would stay there and I would say, man, let's ride this hard and let's see how it turns out in the end. But I'm sure that Saquon's happy that he's there. Maybe he would have wanted a big deal, but look, you got a really cool team to be building with. I'm sure he sees that, and this is a great opportunity for him to potentially take it to the next level as a team.
We talked about the Waller and wide receivers already. No need to revisit that. The big moves were really on defense, and it's a passing league. I think we'll both agree with that. And adding interior defensive linemen and inside linebackers, isn't sexy. It's not going to go to the headlines. But I will say this, Thomas, one of the most demoralizing things I think for a team is watching another team run the ball on you. And it makes it very difficult to win football games. And that happened time and time again. I mean, Eagles went for 200 yards on the ground against the Giants twice last year. They're in your division. So to me, even though this is maybe not the value play in the NFL now, you have to be competent against the run if you're going to have a chance on defense. And I think that was kind of the guiding force, behind the Okereke move and the Roches Nunez move inside.
Yeah, look, starting with the Okereke move, I mean, look, I'm all for that. I think, of course, you guys, I say this respectfully, I mean, interior, you guys need to continue to build the interior there. Of course, as you just mentioned, getting a stud type linebacker in there. I love it. I'm sure Wink Martindale loves the fact that he has someone like that he can build around. I believe Okereke, isn't he 26 years old as well?
26, you got it.
So he's a young cat who you can continue to grow with, has a presence. I know that there was some talk out there where he was with his coverage skills, but I think scheme related, sometimes that can have something to do with it. I think Wink has obviously a very good idea of how he's going to play that along with the run. So I'm completely lauding that move. I think that's a great move by Joe and Brian. So that's great. The D line, just remember this defensive line group in the draft, man, you guys are, I mean, it is set up to pull some really good football players, interior guys. You watch some of those guys out there in the draft, if you've seen them, at the combine, watching them run around, watching them move, the explosiveness. I know it's not just watching in the combine, but when you see some of the athleticism there and the ability to move along the line and make plays as well as, stack it where you need to stack it, I think that's going to be fun to see where they go. With all those picks that you guys have and Giants have, I think it's going to be great for them to pop off maybe 2 or 3 important interior defensive people.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. And now let's move on to the draft here where the Giants still have to grow. And we've talked about the wide receivers a little bit. They kind of have a bunch of these, guys that can play inside. If Sterling Shepard comes back, Wando Robinson is an inside guy. And I feel like this draft, Thomas, is littered with a bunch of 5'9", 5'10", 11-ish type receivers that maybe some people might see more as slot guys versus outside. Who are some of the guys that you like day 1, day 2, even early day 3, that you think can win outside consistently, even if they're not like your true X, et cetera, et cetera. We know Quentin Johnson's there and all that stuff, but guys that maybe can convert their skills to play outside and win as a separator outside in the National Football League.
I knew you were going to ask me this. I just finished my free agency work and I need to really dig down. This is probably not the answer you want to hear. I won't feel comfortable talking about.
No, that's fine. That's okay.
Names. I mean, of course I know the main guys, but I want to be honest with you. I'm in a spot right now where I really need to now start dipping in and watching all the video because I don't normally like commenting on people without having some.
All right. So Thomas, how about this? I'm going to talk more thematically then. What traits do you look for players that maybe you're not your classic 6'3", 6'4" X guys that you say, all right, this isn't a slot only guy. We think we can play him and have him win outside.
Well, look, I mean, that versatility element is big. And we had some good fortune in Atlanta over the years by having that versatility guy who you can move outside and still take it out up the sideline, of course, and underneath. I mean, look, hands down, when you're talking about receivers, I'm sure you probably know this. that separation ability, the awareness, separation ability and awareness, it doesn't mean you always have to be a 4-3 or a 4-2 guy. You can be a 4-5-5 guy as long as you're sticking your foot in the grass and you're able to separate. That's a really, really important element. As I mentioned, the awareness to know how you're going to break things off, how you're going to play off of certain leverages that the defensive backs are presenting you, of course, is really important. Of course, you have to have the ability to catch around your body. Everyone knows that. I won't get into just truly evaluating receivers, but when you're walking away from guys that you can count on and versatility, the versatility element brings 5, 6, or 7 of these traits into play. And if you don't have them, obviously it's going to be revealed quite quickly in my mind as a receiver. So in the end, in my mind, we were very particular about getting a big guy. Of course, we were hopefully going to have our 1 and 2s be guys that had size. Now, we did not do that when we brought in Calvin Ridley because he was a little smaller, but his separation was so good that it counterbalanced that idea that we wanted 2 bigger guys. That third guy has the opportunity to do everything, stop, start, the versatility to go in and out, but loving the idea for him to be a legit inside guy, which is important. And then you start thinking about the rest of that group, as you know how important it is. There are special teams contributions that are really important for these receivers. And sometimes people will say, well, how do we overlook that, or have we overlooked that? If you can get a really good receiver who is adept at special teams, has the upside to be a 3, that's a really sound place to be when you're building your receiver group. Every once in a while, you get that guy who was a 4 or a 5 as a special teams contributor, and he becomes your 2. That's when I think you've hit proverbial gold, and maybe not gold, but you've hit it.
You know, you mentioned size. I think most people, when they think about wide receivers and even cornerbacks and size, they think height and length, right? But I feel like at these positions, players are becoming a little bit lighter coming out now too, right? We had Devonta Smith last year. You have other guys this year. Tank Dell, Emmanuel Forbes, the corner is 160 something pounds, or soaking wet. He, looks like a stick figure when you watch him on tape. Without getting into the individual guys, where do you think that weight factor comes into play, Thomas, in the evaluation? What makes you nervous about those guys on the football field? Is it tackling for corners? Is it staying healthy? Where does the weight and that sort of thing play into it when you're looking at the perimeter players, as some of these guys just start getting a little bit smaller?
Are you referring to both offense and defense?
Both sides. You can take them both separately if you want.
Yeah, look, I'm a huge believer in athleticism and movement, right? Fluidity. That's a big thing for me, right? Back to what we say, it's a matchup league. If you can't match up in that corner receiver mode because you're plodding and heavy-legged, was what we refer to. I don't even know if that's a word. I think it's something we create.
Yeah, works for me.
Legged. I've often wondered, but the reality is making sure that you have the movement and the athleticism and the explosiveness to stay, as you know, the phrase stay in phase is really, really important. So when you see those guys out there that are all shredded up and they may be 85, 80, 75 starts to get a little light. But, as you had mentioned in Philly, I mean, they have a really good receiver there that can do all kinds of crazy things. You hope that you guys don't hope this. They hope that he stays healthy, of course. But I will say I'm not that concerned. I do start getting concerned when you're in the low 70s. And we had this before, when a guy starts teetering, he comes in at 73 as a corner or a receiver. And believe me, when he comes into camp at 73, he's getting down to 68 to 65. You're in a completely different world. It's like you and I don't know what your weight is, but it's like,
too high.
Yeah, no, too high. But you get those guys where you're always trying to get them up. And you're trying to, fatten them up, so to speak, but then you don't want them to be 180 because they're over their limits and they're not as quick and fast and explosive as you want. You really want that guy who's solid and sound at 80, but 75 you can deal with it. And then know that he's not going to be falling down into the 60s.
All right, I got 2 more quickies before we say goodbye, Thomas. Thank you for the time. This has been great. Interior offensive line. It's something the Giants have been working on. Do you feel like you have to be great in there? Or do you just look for competency? I know it's not considered, one of those premium positions. How did you approach that interior offensive line and trying to get that built in front of Matt Ryan, who as a pocket passer really didn't like to have guys coming into, right in his face?
Well, that's a great point. I mean, look, you take Daniel and you take Matt Ryan as well, right? Again, suggesting that Daniel was that much more fluid in movement. what we realized very quickly on that, honestly, Matt could drop back and deal with the perimeter rush. It was that rush coming up in his face that could be devastating for us at times. One of the big reasons I never ever thought in my early years that I would use a big time free agent move on an interior guy. Bringing in an Alex Mack was one of the best free agent moves in the 13 years that I was there, that I felt that we followed through on. He set such a tone, right? That center, not only his intelligence and everything, his presence, sit his ass down in there, anchor in, punch, move, and pass things off by having him along with a really sound right guard. We in Chris Lindstrom, who just got signed to a really big contract. Interestingly enough, we were inconsistent over those years to have the three. Every year, one position in there was kind of lacking. And I thought the teams that were playing us saw that one position. And before you know it, they were pressuring Matt in a certain way. So the three are really important. Of course, I believe the center is, but if you can pull those three together, you don't necessarily have to pay a ton of money. Consistency is a huge thing for me, right? And you need a guy that's going to be able to sit in there and prevent the pocket from collapsing, which we know that's not, again, rocket science. Consistency to anchor properly. And of course, if you have the right run game, let's not get away from that. If your run game is sound and you can take some pressure off your quarterback along with good, not necessarily great interior guys, I think you have a chance to do some really special things on an offensive side of the ball.
All right, final question, big picture. NFC East, record-wise, best division of football last year. I think their out-of-division schedule had something to do with the winning percentages there. But look, Philly's awesome. Dallas, I think, got better this offseason with the additions they've made. Washington's got a good roster if they can figure out the quarterback. But then generally, the NFC is kind of wide open, right? I mean, you look at all the super quarterbacks, they're kind of all in the AFC. We'll see where Aaron Rodgers winds up, obviously. Just your thoughts on the division and the conference, and if there's really a window here in the NFC to try to make a run.
Well, look, I'm going to lead off. So Mr. Mayor is happy that I'm on your website here. But look, I mean, where you guys are right now will lead in. As I mentioned at the outset, I really like the thoughtfulness of this organization. And I like the fact that you guys are investing where you need to be investing as a Giants organization. I think that's really, really important. And I think great things ahead, quite honestly, given your leadership. You look at Philadelphia, and Howie Roseman and I have always been, we've always been friends and contemporaries and competitive over the years. And I've told him recently, I mean, their team this year, as you well know, anyone who follows it, they are really, really together. They're playing so well. Back to the year back in 2017 when they beat our asses down the stretch, go and win the Super Bowl. To me, their football team this year was exponentially better than it was that year winning the Super Bowl. Obviously, things fell apart. I think they come back with a vengeance as well. Obviously, they have a head coach who knows what he's doing there. They're building together, is pulled together really well. They're another very thoughtful team in the league. And, again, defensively, offensive line, I think they come to the table, and it's going to be tough. They're going to be tough to beat once again. As much as you hate hearing that, I get that. So do I.
I don't disagree.
I saw Howie Roseman the other day. I don't know if you saw it. He was taking a shot with Kelsey of Mezcal. And by the way, just so you guys know, he's a part owner in that company. He didn't necessarily say that. So I think he was doing a little bit of marketing there. Howie is always he's always the businessman, right? So Philly, you sit there and you think about Dallas. I'm a big fan of Dan Quinn, as you know, right? I think what they're doing there with their defense, they kept people, they continue to build there and be smart there. Moving on from a running back there that I heard Dak Prescott like basically crying in his soup, so to speak. Like, that's a tough one, right? See what's going to happen there. They are a good football team as well. I'm not that versed in what's going on in Washington. I just think with you guys, with Philly and Dallas, man, that's going to be a real show to see how that plays out in and out every game down the throughout the season.
Thomas, this was fantastic. Very educational. I know I learned a lot. I hope our listeners did as well. Tell everybody about what you're doing with SumerSports and anything you want them to know about you and your company.
Yeah, just if you get a chance, go to SumerSports.com. We have a ton of content there. We are a roster optimization tool, basically. Our clients are the NFL, of course, as it stands right now. Of course, there's ultimately all kinds of business opportunities. roster optimization is a big thing. I'll leave you with this. We could take 32 general managers right now, sit them in this room, and they would raise their hand, every one of them, and say, absolutely not an exact science what we're doing. Absolutely, if they're being honest, even though the owners don't want to hear this, so they don't want to necessarily say it to the owners, there needs to be more exactness in the way that we're approaching our roster building. I've been in the league almost for 30 years. I've been around it all my life. My dad was a football coach, and I always thought there's got to be a better way. And I have a great deal of confidence in my ability to evaluate, but there is an augmentation element there. There's data out there. And I use this line, it sounds very exaggerated, criminally underutilized data within every organization out there, that if a general manager opens up, understands the old school side of football, and utilizes roster optimization data, it can only make him that much better. I maintain that it can take the good GM from being good to being very good, and the very good to being a Hall of Famer. And in the end, roster optimization allows us. I used to go to Arthur Blank and I'd say, Arthur, I have 12 scenarios, and I was proud as a peacock that I had 12 offseason scenarios. What we are doing with SumerSports with our algorithm, it's a advanced algorithm that has over 54 models building in it and growing. What it truly does is it allows that algorithm to present for each specific team their optimal 53 roster. Doesn't mean you have to go with it. It allows this algorithm to produce millions and millions of options, unlike my 12. Doesn't mean you're going to pour through a million, but you could say, Sumer, give me your top 3 roster optimization rosters for the New York Giants. And Joe Schoen would be able to look at it, compare to what they have. And then it just starts the juxtaposition element, which we're really, really, really focused on. We think this can revolutionize. You know, our founder, our founder and chairman is Paul Tudor Jones. Paul's one of the most famous macro traders in the world, right? So he has a massively in-depth understanding of roster or portfolio management, and modern portfolio theory is a big part of what we're doing here. So again, it brings old school football, with me being there, being the domain expert as a CEO, along with our 30 quants and engineers, to really hone in on trying to build something that we think is revolutionary.
Well, I'm really happy we spent a lot of this conversation on team building, given what you guys are doing. And you've piqued my interest, so I have to follow up here real quick. Give me one or two, and I don't want you to give the algorithm away because that kind of defeats the point of people paying you to do this for them, obviously. But give me one or two of what you think are the, to quote you, criminally underutilized data points that teams maybe ignore, but they shouldn't, that maybe we should keep an eye on.
Well, look, I'll state it this way. When I said we have 54 models and growing, I mean, those models are all based around aging curves, financial curves, participation. There, within all of those curves, I could go on and on listing. There's subsets within there. What our wildly intelligent group is, I call them the intelligentsia, right? I sit down with some of these guys, blown away how smart they are. I learn every day from them. I hope that I'm imparting some, sort of domain information and expertise to them so that we can grow. What I'm ultimately saying is we can continue to grow and provide that data that's in the building that next gen stats supplies. Too often, I will say this as well, there is no organization out there that has probably more than 3, 4, or 5 people in their data departments. We, again, coming to the table with over 30 and growing towards 50, we think that we can be that group that can provide the NFL teams with the man and woman power that we know that they need to, as far as pouring into the data that's sitting there in their organizations that can be utilized. Again, it's in our league, just so you know this, back to football, any of us that have a long-standing scouting background and football background, we are all about juxtaposition. It's about comparing, right? It's about taking those 10 top corners that you're looking at, or inside linebackers or guards, and being able to utilize SumerSports in this situation to be able to run your numbers on all of those players to truly see what our models are saying is the true order versus what you may be and your scouts as an organization may be looking at. And in the end, it's your job as an organization to override. We are suggesting what we know, given everything we're taking into consideration, what we believe is, the best. And I will say this, the last thing, I would not have taken a job like this. I would have tried to get back into the NFL and worked my way back up towards a general manager job. But the opportunity to be in something like this that I know I've been looking at for years and years, that there has to be a better way to truly evaluate at the core. And I'm excited about where we're going.
Thomas Dimitroff, CEO of SumerSports. Go check it out. That's SUMER. You can see it in the lower third on the screen. Joining us on the John Huddle podcast, brought to you by PSEG. Thomas, great stuff. We really appreciate the time. Best of luck, and we'll talk to you down the road.
Look forward to talking again. Thank you, John.
Thanks for being with us, everybody. We'll see you next time on the John Huddle podcast.